Well, hello again, and welcome to week 4 of our course, where we're going to look at how to rank Type 1 risks. And of course, we're still in the MuseumStudy program. I'm still Rob Waller, still playing with snakes. And now, at this point, you have considered your collection and its local situation. You found web-based information on hazards affecting your area, and you've looked at the risk evaluation and planning project, whichever, the REPP, guides on assessing risks. Now, this week, we want to add to this, looking at Google Earth images of your site, adding notes from a guided walkthrough of your site, building, rooms, and so on, and completing a modified risk evaluation and planning program worksheet. Now, what we'd like you to do this week, in as much as you can in about 2 hours, to find the Google Earth images for your site, print them out, or copy them onto a PDF or picture that you can do some electronic editing over, and annotate them with some hazard source information, perhaps highlighting overhead trees, over roof wires, nearby creeks that could flood, if you can get the information where your water mains are, and actually you may be able to find some information like that. And to add in risk mitigating factors, you could locate fire hydrants on your Google Earth image, good drainage features, so on. A number of things, security lighting, quite a few things that you may be able to find. It'll be interesting for you, I think, once you do get your Google Earth image, maybe on a couple of scales of zooming in and out, and to start marking them up with what you can see around you and what you're aware of around you that might influence risk to your collections. Now the second, as much as you can in 3 hours, I'd like you to add notes from a guided walkthrough. And the guide for this is in the file Risk Assessment Walkaround. It's not quite like a checklist, but it is somewhat. It prompts you to look at certain things as you start walking around the site. Well, first consider the location, then walk around the site, and then look at the building envelope and features, and then go from there into rooms and look at rooms. But that should be interesting for you, I think. I just ask you to go through that in maybe about 3 hours dedicated to that. And then, as much as you can in 2 hours, to complete the modified REPP worksheet. Now, that worksheet's going to be available to you as this file, REPP Risk Prioritization Worksheet Revised for Collection Vulnerability, and that should be available to you on the MuseumStudy site. With Type 1 risks identified, so I'd like you to populate this sheet with at least one specific risk identified for each of the agents of change: physical forces, fire, water, criminals, and contaminants. Probably not other agents. We tend to not have Type 1 light risks, which would be like the sun going supernova, or Type 1 pest risks, which would be a proverbial biblical swarm of locusts eating up your collections. So some of the agents of change don't really manifest as Type 1 risks that we are concerned with, but those that do, try to think up and define a specific risk that's meaningful in terms of not too vague and not too precisely or detailed in definition. Give that about 2 hours. Now let's look at this risk evaluation and planning program worksheet. This is the one that you would have looked at last week on the Heritage Preservation site. But we know from what we've done in the first 2 weeks of this course that it's important for us to avoid vague thinking about risks and how they're defined. And we see in the examples in the REPP workbook, we've got things like earthquake, or just flooding, or flash flood, heavy snow. Well, heavy snow can be a hazard, but we really want to explain that in terms of what path that hazard can take to get at the collection and what kind of effect it might have. So you'll recall that we're trying to encourage ourselves to come up with specific defined risks. So we might replace this 1A earthquake hazard with a 1.1 earthquake, all sorts of effects, and then underneath that have a number of specific risks. So earthquake leading to building collapse, leading to collection items being crushed, or earthquake leading to suspended items falling, like light fixtures or sprinkler systems or whatever's suspended from the ceiling but perhaps not held well enough to withstand an earthquake. And that could result in collection items being broken or scarred, and so on. So we see how we want to just be more clear in our thinking about what the specific risk scenario is that we're considering, and that will make it quantifiable in a more meaningful. Now, and this is just to remind us that we did talk about identifying risks and the importance of defining them clearly and striving to define, whenever possible, 3 components to a specific risk scenario, where one is the source of the hazard, what's expected to cause the harm, then the path, how does the hazard actually get to collection items, and finally the effect, what is the physical effect on collection items, and how might that result in a loss in value for the intended uses of the collection. Now, here is the REPP as it was, and then below that is as we've modified it. And so here you might notice earthquake has been replaced by these series of specific earthquake risks. Now also here, severity of damage, which we had as just a simple scale of 1 to 5, has been replaced by 2 questions. How much of the collection do we expect will be affected? Will it be all or just a part of the collection? And then how much of the value might be lost to that part of the collection that's affected? And those 2 variables are multiplied together to come up with a severity of damage that's then on a scale of 1 to 5. Because we find that when we want to quantitatively evaluate a risk, those 2 components, how much of the collection do we expect to be affected, is one significant part, and then how much of the value of that fraction we expect to be lost is another significant part. And we can look at a few examples of this. And now, since we're just putting these on a scale of 1 to 3, our guide for that is that we would use a 1 if we expect less than 10% of the collection to be affected, or less than less than 10% of the value to be lost. We would score that as a 1. If it's anywhere in the mid-range, between 10 and 90%, then we'd score that as a 2. And finally, if more than 90% of the collection we expect to be affected, that would be a 3, or if more than 90% of the value is expected to be lost, then that also we would score as a 3. And in fact, for the first rough cut at risk assessment, this idea of is it nearly none or less than 10%, is it somewhere in the middle between 10 and 90, or at the other extreme, is it more than 90% of the collection or of the value that we expect to be affected? That is the most important decision. Now, here, let's consider this collection of shapes. It's an assortment of spheres and cubes and pyramids and that sort of thing. And we notice they have some different colors. But if we consider that to be our collection, and the collection to be housed in this 3-story building, let's consider the surroundings, the site, and we see that the building has a basement and 2 elevated floors. Now let's imagine a situation where there's a flood of surface water that fills the basement with water. Now our first question would be, how much of the collection do we think will be affected? 1, 2, or 3? Well, it looks like it's about a third of the total collection, so that would be, say, 30%, or number 2. So let's call how much of the collection would be a 2. Now, how much value loss would there be? Now, this might be a little bit more tough, because certainly it's going to be different whether these collection of shapes are actually stone carvings as one extreme, or perhaps paper mache carvings or objects as another extreme. Those are going to be really big differences. But let's assume that what we have here are some, say, polychrome sculptures. So they will be affected significantly, but they will retain probably their overall shape, maybe add some cracks and some soiling, that sort of thing. But the value loss is probably intermediate, so we'd set that at a 2. Now, let's go back to our pristine collection in our 3-story building. And in this case, let's assume that there's a contaminant issue where there's a nearby forest fire causing smoke to be blown throughout the whole building and covering pretty much the whole collection with soot and that sort of thing. Well, I did mention whole collection, so when we think about how much of the collection, we're going to think the whole thing, or we'd call that a 3 for sure. Now, how about the loss in value, though? Here we see that the shapes are certainly retained. They all have, if it was a sphere, it's still a sphere. If it was a cube, it's still a cube, and so on. But the colors have been lost. So now we really need to speak with a curator and find out, well, how important is coloration to these objects? Is most of the value for the intended use of the collection derived from the shape of the objects, which really hasn't been changed at all? In fact, it may be a bit more visible with this kind of hazy coating on them. Or is a lot of the value in the coloration? Well, here we find the curator said, no, this is really about the shapes. The colors are pretty, but they don't add a lot of value to the way that we use this collection. So, it's a 3 and 1. Now, we go back to our pristine collection in our building. Whoa, and we find that there's a fire. Very much looks like a catastrophic fire to me. So again, how much of the collection was affected? I think we're getting the hang of this now. Looks like it's pretty much all toast, so that would be a 3. And how much value has been lost? Well, let's say here it's, don't think there's very much value left in that little bit of ash there. So let's call that a 90, more than 90%, pretty much 100%. So again, that would be another 3. So these are just 3 examples of how we would rate the severity of a risk based on these two measures. How much of the collection do we expect will be affected? Very little, a middling amount, or almost all? And then how much of the value of the affected part of the collection will be lost? Is it just a tiny bit, almost an inconvenience or a bother, or is it a middle-ish amount, or is it almost all? Now, our other question when we come back to our workbook, we've talked about how much of the collection will be affected and how much value will be lost, and then that's automatically converted to this measure from 1 to 5 of the severity of the damage. But now we're left with, well, what's the likelihood of occurrence? And here we recognize that events can occur from, say, multiple events per year, as in the case of a meteorite shower. There's not many nights, but quite a few nights through the year we'll have meteor showers coming down on us. But in the other extreme is a major asteroid striking the Earth and wiping out much of the animal life on the Earth. Now, one of these, the meteorite shower, perhaps 3 times a year. The asteroid hitting the planet, maybe about 1 time in 100 million years. So it's a huge range in this likelihood of occurrence. And one thing that is helpful to remember as a guide to this, and I might just mention that in the key in the workbook I've offered some interpretation of how to interpret the 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in terms of likelihood of occurrence. I must admit I changed that after setting up this slideshow, so some of those 1, 2, and 3 things may appear a little strange, but sorry about that. We'll get that straightened out in due course. But I'd like to remind you of what's a sort of 10 to 10 rule of thumb in the magnitude of major events that impact us, whether they're risk events or benefit events or almost any kind of event that follows the what we might call the natural order of things. And that is that the kind of event we might expect to happen once every 10 years is going to be 10 times greater than the sort of event that we expect to happen every year. The kind of event that might happen once every 100 years is likely going to be about 10 times as damaging or significant, if it's a risk, 10 times as damaging in terms of lives lost or property lost or whatever, than the comparable event that just occurred every decade or so. And then moving on, if you have about 30 years of experience with your institution, then you might think, well, what's the worst kind of rain event that we experienced over those 30 years? And if you want to project, well, how significant an event should we think of, say, over a 300-year period? That would be, what kind of event would have a 1/3 chance of occurring over the next 100 years? And that would be about 10 times as intense, as drastic, as damaging an event as what you've experienced over 30 years. So the real take-home lesson here is not to think, oh, well, we know what's happened over the last 30 years, so that may happen 3 times over the next 100 years. It's not like that. We would anticipate an event that's 3 times the severity, 3 times the rainfall in a certain time, 3 times the amount of damage over the next 100 years. Or if we want to consider the really most drastic event, like, say, a 1/3 probability of a 300-year event, then we need to think of something that's 10 times worse than our 30 years experience has shown us. So it's the kind of rule of 10 to 10, and it's very common for all sorts of natural events and even man-made events too, like industrial accidents. So here we come to your mission for this week will be obtain Google Earth images of your site and annotate as discussed. Then when you've put about 2 hours into that, post to the forum with your most interesting observation and information that you would have wanted but could not find at all. So those are just 2 things, like 2 sentences that you need to write and get them posted to the forum. Your most interesting observation and information that you thought would be important to find but you just could not find it. From your guided walkthrough, just conduct that as we discussed, maybe allowing about 3 hours for that as a maximum, and do what you can in that time. And then at the end of that, again, post to the forum with your most interesting observation and some information that you would have liked to have found, but you just weren't able to in the 3 hours that you gave, that you had for doing that walkthrough. And then finally, complete the modified REPP worksheet and rate at least 6 specific risks, and then post to the forum with your identified and defined risks and the risk ratings that you obtained for those. So 3 major tasks. After each task, we want a very brief reporting to the forum on how it went. So good luck with your mission this week, and feel free to contact me at any time if you want any help. Ciao for now. Bye.